From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Caitlin Lyons.
President Trump convenes his first cabinet meeting at the White House featuring Elon Musk for a discussion on the DOGE, Ukraine, and tariffs. We'll have more ahead with Peter Navarro, senior counselor to the president for trade and manufacturing.
Republican congressional leaders also at the White House today to talk tax plans with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent after the House narrowly passed a budget blueprint last night. We'll have reaction from Democratic Congresswoman Suzan DelBene of Washington.
We'll also bring you analysis from Haines at Pangaea Policy as the markets work to digest both fiscal questions and fundamentals, with Nvidia now gaining after a better-than-expected forecast. The results after the bell, the company's conference call, is just beginning now.
And we'll bring you more details in just a moment, but we start with President Trump hosting the first cabinet meeting of his second term today at the White House with a wide array of topics up for discussion. Here are the highlights.
President Zelenskiy is going to be coming on Friday. That's now confirmed, and we're going to be signing an agreement which will be a very big agreement. One of the most important initiatives is DOGE, and we have cut billions and billions and billions of dollars. These companies can go and buy a gold card, and they can use it as a matter of recruitment. At the same time, the company is using that money to pay down debt. We're fighting every day to get the prices down. The inflation is stopping slowly. We'll be announcing it very soon, and it'll be 25%, generally speaking, and that'll be on cars and all other things. And European Union is a different case than Canada.
Mr. President, can you clarify the Canada-Mexico tariffs? You had put that 30-day pause, but you just referred to April.
25%.
25%. When does it go into effect?
April 2nd.
All right, joining us now with the latest from today's cabinet meeting, Bloomberg's national security reporter, Dan Flatley. This went on for over an hour, Dan, and we covered a lot of ground. Only 2 red headlines on the terminal in that entire hour-long exercise. Trump says Canada-Mexico tariffs go into effect April 2nd, and EU tariffs to be 25% on autos and other things, as he put it. There's some confusion, though, around what his plans are and what the deadline is. We'll start with Canada and Mexico. Is there any clarity coming from the White House now?
Well, we're still working to get clarity. As we understand it at the moment, March 4th, which is next week, is when we expect this month-long pause to end. Yep. Now, Howard Lutnick, the Secretary of the Commerce Department, said in the cabinet meeting that if Canada and Mexico continue to meet the demands put upon them by the Trump administration, there could be another pause, potentially. Although Trump said that he's moving forward with the tariffs. So, we're not sure on that date yet. We're still working to get some clarity on that. But, of course, anything is subject to change with Trump as the lead negotiator. If he gets what he wants, he may extend them again. On the April 2nd date, which was an interesting date, Trump said he was thinking about doing April 1st, but he's a little superstitious. He doesn't want to run into April Fool's Day. So he's looking at April 2nd. Now, as far as we understand that, we're expecting some reports out of the Commerce Department, out of the U.S. Trade Representative, about a broader tariff on autos from the European Union, potentially these reciprocal tariffs that Trump has talked about, more or less across the board, as a way to rebalance trade with individual countries. So we're still expecting that to be a key date. So keep April 1st or April 2nd on your calendars. As far as March 4th goes, we'll have to see how that works out.
Well, let's talk about February 28th, because it seems now we have confirmation from both President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that this Friday, just 2 days from now, Zelensky will be here in Washington for what he is framing as still negotiations. It sounded, though, like the president today thinks they have a deal already on minerals.
Yes, what a journey these two men have been on. So it wasn't a week ago that Trump called Zelensky a dictator on Truth Social. But now they seem closer, much closer to a deal, an agreement for some critical minerals in Ukraine. And both sides sort of see this, of course, as critical to maintaining U.S. support for Ukraine. So Zelensky says we'll sign basically whatever it is within reason that you put forward, as long as it means continued support from the U.S. And Trump, this is sort of in line with his America First policy, which is basically that the U.S. should be getting something out of its support for other countries. I think that we'll see what happens Friday, but it certainly seems like we are on the one-ish yard line, as Secretary Bessent said yesterday or earlier this week. We're getting, to the goal line here.
All right, Bloomberg's Dan Flatley, thank you so much. Now, Nvidia just released its fourth quarter earnings with revenue beating Wall Street's estimates and strong guidance for the current quarter. Shares right now up about 2.5% in post-market trading. And joining us now with more from New York is the host of Bloomberg Technology, Caroline Hyde. So we have a little bit more movement in the stock now, Caroline, but nothing like what was priced in options markets to the up or downside. Are we just waiting for this call, which has just begun?
It has just begun, and we know that the CFO, Colette Kress, is already talking through just the ramp up, the scale of delivery of Blackwell, $11 billion revenue already that they managed to see in the fourth quarter. And they talk about sales exceeding expectations, the fastest ramp in the company history. I think that we were expecting volatility, up to 10% swings either direction. 2.6% seems rather nice on the back of it. But remember, we did sell off so hard on the back of DeepSeek. They've still got ground to make up. They've got to tell us that the inferencing strategy, the move from moving training models onto inference, isn't going to cost them so much margin. That margin guide was something that the market was a little bit worried about.
Well, really interesting as we answer or try to ask questions and seek answers to questions about export controls here in Washington, Caroline. That seems to be the D.C. angle. When anybody brings up Nvidia or any high-tech chips, they apparently have done nothing to hurt the company's business.
Precisely thus far. In fact, maybe DeepSeek managed to push forward its sales in China. They're limited already what they can export to China. H20 chips are what they're allowed to navigate through at the moment. And we understand that probably on the back of DeepSeek, the sudden desire to be building yet further in China, the likes of Alibaba, the likes of Tencent upped their increase in demand from Nvidia. So maybe we see a little push forward in terms of overall sales guidance that's coming from China. But he's got to navigate the winds of politics. And indeed, you sort of see them do that in the press release where they talk about one of the key drivers for future demand is Stargate. That, of course, all-important $100 billion commitment that we got from the likes of Oracle's Sam Altman, of course, Masayoshi Son, alongside President Trump, committing to investing in the United States. And Nvidia is a key tech player in that.
Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde. After the bell, Caroline, it's great to have you with us here on Balance of Power. We'll keep eyes on shares of Nvidia as we go through the evening here. Coming up, House Republicans passing a budget framework barely, and the process is not about to get any easier. We'll take a look across the aisle ahead with Democratic Congresswoman Suzan DelBene of Washington. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We need an opportunity to talk about, to air our grievances, for lack of a better word. And I think it's a healthy process. But then we understand this is a team sport. We had to come together and actually pass this. And I think there's been, you mentioned it briefly, a lot of misconception. I mean, this resolution really is almost a procedural part, on the budget, where the real work begins on the committees.
Republican Congressman Troy Downing of Montana today on the early edition of Balance of Power on the road ahead for reconciliation after a budget blueprint narrowly passed the House last night. And joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is one of his House colleagues from across the aisle, Democratic Congresswoman Suzan DelBene of Washington, who is also chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Congresswoman, we just heard from our reporters on the Hill that the Speaker has just suggested there could be some new ideas put into the reconciliation package for more cost savings, talking about the cuts from the DOGE, tariffs, and this new gold card the president is talking about that would cost $5 million, and he says is a way to raise revenue. If they can find savings that mean ultimately they don't have to tap into Medicaid funding, how does that need to change Democratic messaging?
Well, first, let's be clear. They passed a budget last night which would explode the deficit, which would raise costs for families across the country, take away health care. That's what they voted on, and that's what they passed. Now, if they have kind of ideas that are going to, change around that, then I think they're going to have to address that going forward. Also, you saw that DOGE had posted areas where they thought they had saved money and then they had to take them down. I think the reality of what they're doing and whether they truly are saving costs in places is yet to be seen.
Well, there's another matter that needs to be handled, Congresswoman, and that's funding the government. What are we, 16 days away, I think, from a potential government shutdown? If I understand things correctly, you and your Democratic colleagues have been spectators throughout this process. The Republican conference is moving on its own. That's why it was so close that night. But they're going to need Democrats to help keep the government funded past the middle of March. Will you be there?
Well, first of all, we should never have been in this position. We should fund the government for a full year at a time, and Republicans only wanted a short-term funding bill. So now we're in the situation where the government runs out of money on March 14th. And frankly, I'm not sure what their plans are. They aren't working across the aisle to address what's happening. And as you said, we keep getting closer and closer, and I don't think they even know what to do or if they agree with each other. But I also can tell you that Congress decides how money should be spent, and Congress appropriates funds. That's how these bills work. And if the administration is not going to follow those laws that we put in place, that's also a huge concern. So we need to know that when Congress says, here's how money should be spent, that it's going to be allocated and spent that way. That's a very important issue given what we've seen from the administration so far.
Well, we do understand that issue is one of the things Democrats have discussed, asking Republicans for in exchange for support on continuing to keep the lights on, that there are guardrails around the way in which this administration can decide what money goes where. Has there been any movement, to your knowledge, or shared with you by leadership from Republicans on that front?
I think Republicans don't even agree with Republicans most of the time, so it's unclear what they're going to do, and they are already shutting parts of the government down with the actions from this administration and Elon Musk. So they are not focused on good governance or efficiency or on saving money. It's just been a focus of chaos and dysfunction so far.
Of course, you run the DCCC, as our viewers on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube can see right now. You're very on brand this evening, Congresswoman. It's your job, if people don't know what that means, to get Democrats elected, to retake the House in the midterms. Does the outcome of this budget reconciliation process, including the Trump tax cuts, everything we're talking about here, and funding the government, and layer on the debt ceiling while you're at it, does the outcome here determine who will control the House in 2 years?
Well, I actually think it was really clear that this last election was about costs and families wanting the government to address affordability, to lower costs for families, to make sure that people can thrive across the country. Republicans haven't been focused on cuts at all. In fact, every action they're taking would be about raising costs on working families, raising costs for health care, tariffs that would raise costs at the grocery store, at the gas pump, at the pharmacy counter. That's what they're doing, and that's what this budget looks like. A budget's a statement of your values, and their values seem to be focused on tax cuts for the most wealthy and making working families pay for it. And so that's absolutely all on them. That's their priority, but that's not the priority of the American people. Republicans made promises in the last election that they're not keeping, and they're going to pay for it in the midterms, and we'll take back the majority.
Well, I'm wondering about the members who are facing potentially what could be tough races as they were in 2024 in swing districts in states like, say, California and New York, higher tax states in which the SALT cap is still an issue. That is up for discussion in these reconciliation talks. Are there any Democrats suggesting to you, Congresswoman, that they may actually want to support this legislation if it does indeed increase the SALT cap for their constituents?
Well, so all of the committees will do their pieces based on the budget that Republicans put out. They're going to have committees meet. And so we will be having discussions with great detail about how they think they're going to achieve their goals. And that's going to be really where the specifics come into play, where we see exactly what their priorities are for tax cuts for the wealthiest, but also the priorities for where they're going to cut resources going to working families. So we're going to see that. And those are the places where we're going to see things like SALT and other programs be discussed. But I don't know where they're going to end up on that. If they want to work across the aisle, then we would want to work across the aisle, except for this budget already puts it in a position where they aren't interested in working across the aisle and have set up goals that are not focused on working families. So really, this is their process. This is their budget.
The message from the Democratic Conference in the House, the DCCC Democratic Congresswoman Suzan DelBene of Washington. Thank you so much for being with us on Balance of Power. We were speaking earlier about tariffs. President Trump answering a wide range of questions, touched on a lot of issues today during the first official cabinet meeting of his second term. They covered the DOGE, a minerals deal with Ukraine, and yes, a renewed tariff threat.
Mr. President, can you clarify the Canada-Mexico tariffs? You had put that 30-day pause, but you just referred to April.
25%.
25%. When does it go into effect?
April 2nd.
April 2nd for Canada-Mexico.
Correct. And for everything.
Joining us now for the latest on these upcoming tariffs and a lot more is a man who was sitting right behind President Trump as he was conducting that meeting today. Peter Navarro, White House Senior Counselor for Trade and Manufacturing, with us from the North Lawn. It's great to see you. Mr. Navarro, welcome back. There's a little bit of confusion about some of the conversation we heard with reporters today, and so we really appreciate your joining us to maybe clear this up. Are these tariffs still set to take effect next week? Is March 4th the deadline? And what specifically could Canada and Mexico do to keep them from taking effect?
Well, first of all, in order to understand the trajectory of the president's trade policy, I'd urge everyone watching this show, and presumably most are investors, to read the presidential memorandum of day one of this administration, which lays out all the different types of actions. As for today, I was sitting, as you said, right behind the president. I thought he was quite clear in what he was going to do. For me, I came out here hoping to discuss this week's trade actions kind of in my lane. We did two really important things which for investors really are market moving in the sense. The first was the digital service tax action we took. The president has directed the U.S. trade representative to resume action on these digital service taxes. And for the benefit of your viewers, a digital service tax is something that was effectively invented in France in 2019. It's a tax on things like cloud computing, digital advertising, all of that. But it was done in a way in France which only targeted American companies, specifically the big ones like Amazon, Google, Meta, Netflix, and Microsoft. And essentially, the president back in 2019 saw immediately that this was both a punishment in a discriminatory way of American companies, but also a tax grab from the U.S. Treasury. And so the way that works is these digital taxes are put on and they go on revenues. What that does is reduce profits, then reduce it's like stock prices, and then also reduce revenues from the corporate tax. And
what about Canada and Mexico?
With respect to digital service taxes, well, Canada has one. Mexico does not.
No, we're just trying to clear up what we heard today from the president, Peter. I'm sorry. We're trying to understand whether these tariffs are going to take effect next week.
Because I made it clear that what the president said, just go back and play the clip, and he gave you a timeline. The underlying issue there,
well, they said April 2nd, though. We thought the deadline was March 4th.
The underlying issue, sir, is that too many Americans, anywhere from 50,000 on the low end to 300,000, which I think is the accurate number from the president, die every year from fentanyl that comes in from communist China in big chemical barrels. It goes to the drug cartels in Mexico, and the Mexican cartels then bring some of that up to Canada, and it comes across our border, and people either take it in the fentanyl direct form, or it's laced with other drugs like speed or heroin or whatever, and Americans are dying. So to the extent that that problem is going to be dealt with, I'm not in the center of those negotiations that being done by others in the administration. I would think as long as we have some progress, then we'll see what we will see, but it's up to the president. But the underlying the thing is, sir, it's like whenever I talk to people in the news about tariffs, they also want to cut to this chase over here about what's going to happen, or like always raise the inflation, and they never ask why the tariffs. In this case, it's fentanyl's killing Americans. It's slaughter.
Well, we had a pretty good conversation with you about the why last time, Peter, and we understand the point of making this argument, but we just want to get some answers for our listeners and viewers about when these might take effect. This isn't about inflation, and it's not about the why. We just want to know when.
Asked and answered. I told you. You will go listen to what the president had to say. It's contingent on Mexico's cooperation and Canada's cooperation in terms of killing Americans with fentanyl. What I'm trying to share with you, which I think is for the longer term more germane, is this copper proclamation we did yesterday and the one earlier in the week on digital service taxes has tremendous importance for people's portfolios.
We'd like to talk about that executive order exploring. We would love to talk. We would love to talk, Peter, about copper tariffs. I'm trying to ask you about them right now. I'd like to talk about the copper executive order specifically. When we're talking about a commodity like that, do we have the capacity domestically to make up for anything that may be offset by not being able to import as much? If all of this is about trying to protect American commodity production, to what degree and to how quickly can that be ramped up to make sure that it's still able to meet demand?
So this is never a question of not being able to have enough. It's just a question of what kind of steps we take to protect the domestic copper industry across the smelting and refining process and the mining. So we don't really have to worry about, we're not putting up a wall to imports themselves. We're just trying to deal with this central problem now. And it's a problem across a lot of commodities we have right now. We have a very large overcapacity in copper worldwide. That results in significant dumping into the marketplace here in America, and thereby suppresses our ability to open new mines, which we have. There's two great ones in Arizona we could develop, one up in Alaska we could develop. The smelting itself, which we haven't opened any new smelters in a long time, and others are being opened around the world, and we're simply not having enough refining capacity. That's what we're trying to establish. And the problem is, if you look at the curves, we had a tremendous surge in demand for copper over the next decade because of the electrification of our economy, in part due to things like AI. And so when you chart
and that's why I asked the question about whether shortages could result if you do see that increase in demand, but there are levies in place on importing.
We'll just pay, the tariffs will be paid, we'll get whatever we need. And in the meantime, as we saw with steel and aluminum, we went from a 70% roughly capacity utilization in the first Trump term to 80 in profitability. We had $15 billion of new investment. We had new mills built. And then in the 4 years of Biden, we lost 2 aluminum foundries, and capacity utilization went back down to the low 70s. So what we're trying to do is build a sustainable investment environment for key commodities and products which are critical to our national security. And by the way, why copper? I mean, it seems, well, copper is like the second most important thing that the Defense Department uses for its weapon systems. And it's also part of everything that's high technology. It's part of the electrification of the grid. And we've had a situation where we used to have zero import dependence, and we're up to about 50% now. And if you just keep those lines going, that import dependence is going to increase and increase, and we're going to be vulnerable to shocks and geopolitical problems. And President Trump says that's not the world we're going to live in. We're going to live in one which is safe, secure, and prosperous.
All right, Peter Navarro, White House Senior Counselor for Trade and Manufacturing. Appreciate the time. And still ahead, House Republicans passed their budget framework. We'll take a look at the tax cuts and spending implications with Terry Haines, founder of Pangaea Policy, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
We had the requisite number of votes to move this process along, and now passing the budget resolution in the House that will go to the Senate. This is the first important step in opening up the reconciliation process. We have a lot of hard work ahead of us, but we are going to deliver the America First agenda. We're going to deliver all of it, not just parts of it, and this was the first step in that process.
House Speaker Mike Johnson, after his chamber's budget resolution passed very narrowly last night, providing the blueprint for a reconciliation fight that is still far from over. And joining us now for more analysis here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Terry Haines, founder of Pangaea Policy. Welcome back to Balance of Power. Terry, there are plenty here in Washington, and I'm sure observers in financial markets as well, who didn't actually expect that this thing would go well last night. Now that it has, would you tell markets they should be more confident that the rest of this is going to go off without a hitch, that it may happen sooner than initially expected, given the speed with which the House was actually able to move on this first step?
Oh, Kayleigh, you all know that this is Hitch City. There will be many between now and the end of the year. What I'll say again, I think the tax cut bill gets done by in the fourth quarter of calendar year 2025. I think that's 80% likely. It is very much in the interest of everybody on the Republican side in Congress to get that done and get the biggest tax cut done possible. They will do that, but that said, this is the end of the beginning and nothing more. You've now as Speaker Johnson appropriately says, their hard work has to begin. They've got to get the rubber has to meet the road on what their spending cuts are going to be, on what their deficit number is going to be, and only then do you get to the tax cuts. So this is going to take all year.
Wow. Donald Trump on Truth Social. Following passage of the resolution, Terry, I hope the House and Senate are able to agree on making the tax cuts permanent. All caps, exclamation point. The idea of the House and Senate coming to terms on anything right now would be considered a feat. You've got Republican House members who say the cuts are not deep enough. How much money would it take to make the tax cuts permanent, and how do these two chambers do it all in one bill?
Oh, I think the net on the House side is something like something like a deficit of $3 trillion if you assume that the tax cuts go away at the end of the year. The president's very smart, of course, to keep the pressure on him. And at this point in the process, that's exactly what he needs to be doing. He needs to be keeping the pressure on and staying away from details. What I've been telling people for a while, and what as of last weekend finally started to penetrate into the press publicly, is that there's a question of whether or not Congress proceeds from what's known as a current policy baseline or not. And right now they're not. But a current policy baseline is important because it would allow them to do much bigger tax cuts and have to pay for much less. The current policy is you assume that the tax cuts are going to continue. So therefore, there's a lot less to fill in. There's pressure to do that. It is against current process, but I think if you have Trump, the congressional Republicans, and the markets all lined up to push for the biggest tax cut possible, I think the process probably changes to some extent.
Well, the House Speaker was actually just speaking with reporters on Capitol Hill, suggesting that he favors the current policy baseline, but needs to build consensus around that, which, of course, is a question. The other thing he told reporters, Terry, is that after a meeting at the White House, they've decided that Congress, as part of this reconciliation package, is going to look at including the cuts that the Department of Government Efficiency is making, revenue from tariffs, and revenue from this so-called gold card we're now hearing the president as well as the Commerce Secretary today talk about. Does that make the math on all of this easier if those things are included?
I think not very much. Again, look, if I'm the White House, I'm pressing for all those things. There's a variety of reasons why Congress doesn't want them. It doesn't want them to be part of the reconciliation process. There's procedural. I mean, I'm happy to dive in on that, but you don't want that. But bottom line is you can't count on the savings for example, from something like DOGE. And that's not to disparage DOGE. It's just that the numbers so far aren't quite adding up. I mean, they talk about identifying $55 billion in the first month. I know what identified means. And I've identified future revenues that I'm interested in putting in my pocket, but that doesn't mean I have the revenues in my pocket. So, what ends up happening here is that it becomes all too ephemeral to actually make a big difference.
Well, so as you know, Terry, if that's what's been identified by the DOGE doesn't make the difference, a lot of lawmakers think you have to raid Medicaid. Until, of course, you talk to Donald Trump at the White House today, the president was asked if there would be cuts to Medicaid, Medicare, or Social Security, all the entitlements in either of the proposed budget plans. He reached for an old refrain in his response. Here's what he said.
I have said it so many times, you shouldn't be asking me that question, okay? This will not be read my lips. It won't be read my lips anymore. We're not going to touch it. Now, we are going to look for fraud. I'm sure you're okay with that.
Read my lips, Terry? So what happens to Medicaid?
Well, I was around when Read My Lips happened, and the President Bush 41 ended up cutting a budget deal with Democrats about a year and a half later that he very much regretted, as a result. And, I go back to, the political conundrum here for Republicans is they're going to get caught in they're going to get caught in crossways. On the one hand, what Trump is saying is, very much like what happened in A Few Good Men, right? You said it was not to be touched. The president is not to be touched. But at the same time, of course, we're going to be looking for efficiencies and that are going to get bandied around as cuts. This is the Medicaid version of the Social Security third rail. And so, I think that founders, frankly, and this is going to be a very, there's a reason why John Kennedy wrote the book Profiles in Courage and why it was such a short book. There's not a lot of profiles in courage in the history of Congress. And, I wouldn't put a huge amount of money on Congress in both houses, passing huge Medicaid cuts to the infrastructure, the superstructure of Medicaid, while making sure that the product is delivered seamlessly. That's going to cause an awful lot of angst out there in the world.
Well, there's some angst right now I want to point to based off of a red headline that's just crossed the terminal, Terry. Shares of Moderna in after-hours trading down more than 5% after Bloomberg is now reporting that a $590 million contract awarded during the Biden administration to Moderna for bird flu shots are now being reevaluated, or is now being reevaluated by U.S. health officials. So HHS says it's necessary to review these vaccine agreements. Again, Moderna down about 4.5% right now. But Terry, it's interesting to see this cross after we heard from the president today talking specifically about egg prices, which in part have been driven higher because of bird flu. This is what he said, and then I'll have you respond.
We're fighting every day to get the prices down. The inflation is stopping slowly. But part of the reason it's stopping is because of high interest rates and other problems that we inherited. But we have to get the prices down, not the inflation down, the prices of eggs and various other things. Eggs are a disaster.
Eggs are a disaster, Terry, but is there a way for him to deliver immediate relief on prices to the American people on that specifically if he can't get bird flu under control? What means does he actually have to address prices now? Because we haven't seen it thus far.
Well, he's got a couple, and they, of course, they're not going to address the price of eggs directly, right? They're not going to put price controls on anything. But there's actually two efforts going on in the executive branch right now, and this is going to be an early test of the Trump White House's ability to coordinate policy quickly and to try to make a substantial difference. It's not just what HHS was doing. You quoted to me as it was just crossing the tape. It's also Agriculture Secretary Rollins, who announced a task force of some kind. I think she called it a task force. But the idea is that they're going to go attack avian flu directly through a variety of means. So it's going to be very, very important for Kennedy at HHS, Rollins at Agriculture, and the White House coordinating as well to actually do a bunch of things that address the problem and give the public confidence that Trump is addressing them and that the price of eggs are going to go down fairly soon, because if not, it is going to be seen as kind of an early failed test of their leadership.
Terry, President Trump addresses a joint session of Congress on Tuesday. Will the government shut down a week later?
I had it at about 30 to 40%, and I think rising. And the reason for that is that you have, there's three groups that here, and two of them have reason to support a shutdown. Democrats, of course, Congresswoman DelBene wouldn't say that to you earlier in so many words, but one way of getting the Republicans to own their policy choices, as she put it, is to make sure that Democrats are pushing back on things. And they've made a decision for whatever reason that co-president Musk is a good banner for them. So they're going to push back real hard against what DOGE is doing and what Trump is supporting. And on the other hand, Trump probably wants a shutdown too, I would wager, in no small part because he sees it as a test of the executive's ability to actually keep government spending down. So this thing's going to escalate into a real mess real quickly. And I think a lot of people in Washington wouldn't have predicted that, say, 2 weeks ago. But it's spiraling right now.
Fascinating. It's good to see you, Terry. Thanks for the insights, as always. Terry Haines, you need him on that wall, the founder of Pangaea Policy, here on Balance of Power. Coming up, we get back to the president's first cabinet meeting today, featuring Elon Musk with our political panel. They're up next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
One of the most important initiatives is DOGE, and we have cut billions and billions and billions of dollars. We're looking to get it maybe to $1 trillion. If we can do that, we're going to start getting to be at a point where we can think in terms of balancing budgets, believe it or not, something you haven't heard in many, many years, decades actually.
President Trump during his first cabinet meeting today before turning things over to Elon Musk. As you can see, if you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, for several minutes he spoke to the room, gave an update on DOGE's progress, and took a series of questions from a group of reporters, not the traditional press pool, as we've told you, handpicked by the White House. Now, before the meeting, Donald Trump attempted to dismiss some recent criticism about Musk. There's been a lot of ink spilled over his relationship with members of the cabinet. The president writing, all cabinet members are extremely happy with Elon, and in fact said as much in that meeting, prompting a round of applause at the table. Joining us now this evening's political panel, Matt Gorman is with us, Executive Vice President at Targeted Victory, our Republican strategist, alongside Democratic strategist Kristen Hahn, partner at Rock Solutions. Great to see you both here. Matt, how important was that today optically as a reset when it comes to the way we see Elon Musk? He was not sitting next to Donald Trump. In fact, he wasn't sitting at the table at all. He stood up, gave a brief update on things, as we mentioned. He was wearing the tech support T-shirt and said, I'm your humble tech support man, just your IT guy. Is that what his role is?
In essence, of so many words. But look, I think that I tend to not believe the sanctity of these cabinet hearings. They're not no different than the briefing room, in my opinion. They're not like actual policies getting done here.
So we're all clutching pearls over.
I think a little bit. But look, I think it's important to have him there. Look, DOGE is the biggest story in Washington right now. I think cabinet secretaries have questions. It's the topic we're all covering. Having him not there would probably be a little bit more weird or awkward and noticed. But I think it was good for him to give an update. But it's really, it was the president's show, and he saw that today.
Well, and certainly both he and Elon Musk fielded a lot of questions about DOGE, specifically about the email that went out to federal workers asking them to justify their jobs, recap what they'd done last week if they wanted to keep them. Donald Trump suggested that those who hadn't responded yet, Kristen, are on the bubble. And I do just wonder, considering the mixed messaging we've gotten around this, is this ultimately a communication problem for this White House and this administration more than anything?
I mean, there's clearly a communication problem when you say you send an email out like that. There was clearly a little bit of difference between the White House and DOGE with what happened there, and you saw it say like, okay, we're going to give you a second chance. You know, I mean, there's a lot of miscommunication going on, and I will say that cabinet meeting, I totally agree that it's just for show. But he needed, Elon Musk there and his cabinet secretaries to give that round of applause, in public for communications purposes. It was, I kind of laughed at it, but, that's what he needed.
Well, there was some confusion coming out of this meeting on a number of issues, including tariffs. We tried to get answers out of Peter Navarro a short time ago. He kept pointing us back to what the president was saying. having had to clarify remarks about what we thought were Canada-Mexico tariffs. Yesterday, the White House said, no, he meant reciprocal. Today, we're back to April 2nd. Then with the clarifying saying, no, it's March 4th. Is this an intentional strategy, or do we need to get on the same page?
It's not going to get that far. I think one of the fundamental truths of this second Trump administration, he's relying far more on his business tactics than he did in his first administration. It's a sign of his confidence, right? So again, the playbook, whether it's Gaza, Colombia, Canada, Mexico, Ukraine, it's remarkably simple. He's eminently confident in his ability to get people in a room. So if it's March 4th, the deadline is a little bit sooner, but then it's April 2nd. I don't think we'll see those days, candidly, that where tariffs will go into effect, but it's really just something to butt up against.
Well, so when we're considering looking ahead to next week or the week after that, or looking ahead to next month, trying to get updates from this White House on when exactly this has happened, we've typically heard him talking about these things in settings in which he's with the press pool. Kristen, be it in the Oval Office or in the cabinet room in the meeting today. And as Joe alluded to, the press pool looked a little different today as two wire services, the Associated Press and Reuters, were not invited in favor of the Blaze. Axios had a seat instead of Huffington Post. Bloomberg was still there. We should note we are a member of the pool and the wire service that was represented. But what do you think about this change the White House is making? They say they should get to pick who covers the president. This shouldn't just be up to the White House Correspondents Association.
I think it's very interesting. It's a really good question. You're talking about the structure and what the press pool looks like. And working with folks, communicators downtown at different companies in Washington, this has been a topic of conversation over the past, for a while, but really intensified over the past week and a half with different bloggers, Podcasts allowed in the room, the AP not, we know why. But the changing structure of what the press pool looks like, and they're defying all norms, or deciding who should be there and who should not. And so I think it's all about who, our clients are asking, who should be in front of, how do we get in front of the people who are in the administration? How do we get in front of, what are they watching? What are they doing? And it's something all of us are trying to answer, but they really are kind of done in a lot of ways with traditional media and are trying to find different ways to reach. And they've always done that. And they've done it very successfully.
So drive 100 miles in any direction and tell me no one cares.
Nobody cares with the White House Correspondents Association. No one. Look, I will say this, too. They'll throw out these fights. They'll throw out these little things to get chum in the water because they know the press can't resist covering it. They can't resist talking about themselves. And that's not a critique of you. I was watching cable news all yesterday, and it's all they were talking about with the constitutional crisis eminence of it. Because I think it's something that they can use to kind of reset the table, cleanse the palate a little bit of the press if there's something that's creeping up on them they don't want to talk about, or if they feel like there's a storyline that they want to go away. I don't know if that's the case. Maybe it's DOGE, maybe it's something else. It's a tried-true example we've seen over the last decade.
On the constitutional crisis thing, though, people are looking at the kind of language Elon Musk has used about impeaching judges because he doesn't like their decisions in the courts, or the idea that appropriated funds by Congress may not actually be distributed through the government because DOGE says no. Then you take the press, the so-called fourth estate, and there's First Amendment questions there, too. You don't think any of those are founded?
I think we spent, especially the last 2 years, if not longer than that, saying that democracy was in line, threatening democracy. And yet we all have very good access to the cabinet room and what's happening in the Oval Office.
It's transparent.
I think, I think democracy is still happening. But look, I think that Democrats have overused that rhetoric. And whether or not it's not happening or not, I tend to disagree with folks who say that. However, they've become the boy that cried the wolf in many respects.
Well, we heard state media mention at this table last night that, in fact, if you're picking the people who are covering you and maybe even planting the questions, you're not getting accurate coverage, and that's a disservice to the voter.
I would agree that they're throwing out the playbook and they don't care about, the traditional media. But if they didn't, then he wouldn't be making such a concerted effort to keep the AP out of the room, to keep other people out of the room, because by eliminating these news services that have to fact check and do things, they just get to disseminate their message however they want over, Facebook, which is now not doing the checking that they used to do before. But, I think it goes both ways, and this administration is slowly but surely eroding, the public's confidence in the media. And whether you think about it or not, the AP, look at the AP. The AP is somebody whose stories are just disseminated widely. and you've got people in Akron or in Austin or
reading local news outlets.
Well, they're reading the stories in their local and not even realizing that they're an AP story, but reading that, right? So when they don't have access, and not that the AP isn't doing a good job of covering things anyway, it does impact the entire media outlook and how people are consuming media throughout this country. And I don't necessarily think it's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. So maybe it does go beyond the bubble a little bit, even if we're mostly talking about it inside the bubble. Matt Gorman and Kristen Hahn, thank you so much. And still ahead, a preview of UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer's visit to Washington tomorrow. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We increase spending on defence to play our full part within NATO and to keep the continent of Europe safe against Russian aggression. In terms of the future trading relationship between the UK and the US, last time that President Trump was in the White House, trade and investment between our two countries increased, and I have every confidence that that can happen again.
Rachel Reeves, UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, previewing some likely topics of discussion tomorrow when UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer set to visit President Trump in Washington. It will be interesting, Joe, to hear how they talk about the war in Ukraine and negotiations to end it, as it will set the stage for Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy's own visit to Washington the next day.
Yeah, that's right. No mystery to see this, or why we see this announcement from Keir Starmer. UK hiking military spending to 2.5% of gross domestic product by 2027. We'll hear a lot more about that tomorrow. Read about it in the Washington Edition newsletter, on the terminal and online. We'll see you back here tomorrow
on Bloomberg.